Good evening. I'm Chris Torres. Tonight I am presenting one in a series of episodes examining checkmating patterns in a show named Checking Time. The Arabian Mate was first described in an ancient Persian text about the pre-chess game of Shatranj, which makes it the oldest recorded checkmating pattern in chess. It's worth noting that in Shatranj, the queen and bishop had limited powers compared to their counterparts in chess, so checkmating with the knight, or asp, and rook would have been far more common. The Arabian Mate is a mating pattern that demonstrates the unique way a rook can work together with a knight to checkmate a king on the corner of the chessboard. In order for a checkmate to be considered an Arabian Mate, the rook must be on an adjacent square to the king to prevent escape along the diagonal and deliver checkmate, while the knight is positioned 2 squares diagonally from the king to threaten an escape square and protect the rook. Let's begin examining the Arabian Mate by looking at a contrived example of its most basic components. White to move and mate in 2. Knight f6 check. The king must move to h8. Rook h7 checkmate. The rook is on an adjacent square to the king, both to prevent escape along the diagonal and to deliver checkmate. The knight is positioned 2 squares diagonally from the king to threaten an escape square and protect the rook. Now let's look at a practical example. Our first practical example comes from the game Reiner versus Wilhelm Steinitz, played in Vienna in 1860. White has just played move 17 rook g2, and now black has a mate in 2 using the Arabian Mate. Can you spot it? I will give you 30 seconds. Queen h2 check. Rook takes h2 is forced. Rook g1 checkmate. Again, the rook is positioned adjacent to a king that is in the corner. Our knight is positioned 2 squares from that king diagonally. Let's look at another example. Our next example comes from the game Isidor Gunsberg versus David Janowski, played in Hanover, Germany in 1902. White has just played move 29, king h1, and now black has a mate in 2 using the Arabian Mate. Can you find it? I will give you 30 seconds. Queen takes h3 check. Gx h3 is forced. Rook h2 checkmate. Again, the king that is checkmated is positioned on the corner of the board. The rook is adjacent to that king, and our knight is 2 squares away diagonally. Let's look at another example. Our next example was played by George Koltanowski versus an unnamed opponent during a simul in Akron, Ohio in 1945. Black has just played move 24, rook 8 to g7, and now white has a mate in 2 using the Arabian Mate. Can you spot it? I will give you 30 seconds. Queen takes h7, check. Rook takes h7 is forced. Rook takes h7, mate. Again, the king that is checkmated is positioned on the corner of the board. The checkmating rook is 1 square adjacent to that king. The knight is 2 squares diagonally from that king. Let's look at another example. Our next game is Boris Gelfand versus Vladimir Kramnik, European Club Cup, Berlin, Germany, 1996. After white plays move 28, rook captures b2. Black has a nice mate in 2 using the Arabian Mate. Can you spot it? I will give you 30 seconds. Queen a2, check. Rook takes a2 is forced. Rook b1, checking the king in the corner, defended nicely by the knight, which is 2 diagonal squares away from the king. Let's look at another example. Our next game was played by Lasker and Meraxi in a tandem simul in Derby, England in the year 1900 versus an unnamed adversary. Black is just played knight fx e5, and now white has a mate in 3 using the Arabian Mate. Can you find it? I will give you 45 seconds. Rook takes h7, check. Rook takes h7. Queen g8, check. Rook takes g8. And finally, rook takes g8, mate. The rook is adjacent to its opponent's king. The opponent's king is positioned on the corner of the board, and the rook's knight is positioned 2 squares diagonally away from its opponent's king. Let's look at another example. Our next game is Reuben Fine versus Arthur William Dake, played in Detroit, Michigan in 1933. Black has just played 36, king g8, and now white has a mate in 3 using the Arabian Mate. Can you find it? I will give you 45 seconds. Queen takes g6, check. Hx g6. Knight f6, check. King h8. Rook h7, checkmate. Our opponent's king was forced into the corner. Our rook is 1 square adjacent to the king. Our knight is 2 squares diagonally from that same king. Let's look at another example. Our next example comes from the game William Albert Fairhurst versus Vera Menchik. This was played in England in 1935. Black has just played 31, bishop e6, and now white has a mate in 3 using the Arabian Mate. Can you find it? I will give you 45 seconds. Knight f6, check. King h8. Queen takes h6, check. Bishop must capture. Rook h7, checkmate. Again, we forced our opponent's king to the corner of the board. Our rook sits adjacent to their king, and our knight is 2 squares away diagonally. Let's look at another example. Our next game is between Adolf Anderssen and Emil Scallop. This game was played in Berlin, Germany in 1864. White has just played 32, rook d7, and now black has a mate in 4 using the Arabian Mate. Can you spot it? I will give you 1 minute. Rook g3 check. King h2. Knight f3 check. King h1. Rook h3 check. Gx h3. And finally, Rook h2 checkmate. We forced our opponent's king to the corner of the board. The rook sits one square adjacent to that king. The knight is positioned 2 squares away diagonally. Let's look at one final example. Our last game was played between Mark Taimanov and Bent Larsen at the Capablanca Memorial in Havana, Cuba in 1967. White has just played move 40, bishop d1, and now black has a mate in 5 using the Arabian Mate. Can you find it? I will give you 90 seconds. Rook g5, check. Here, white has 2 options. If 41, king h7, black could play knight f6 check, king h6, and rook g6 checkmate. Though not an Arabian mate, this possible mating continuation is also quite aesthetically pleasing. In the game, however, after black plays 40, rook g5 check, white plays king h8, knight f6. White can throw in a check, bishop a4. But black can simply play king e7. White can delay another move with rook g1. But black can play rook takes g1, obviously. And now white must make a move. c5, and black plays rook g8, placing the rook adjacent to his opponent's king, which is positioned on the corner of the board. The rook is checking the king. The knight is defending the rook 2 squares diagonally away from the king. I hope you have enjoyed this lesson on the Arabian Mate and the unique way in which a knight and rook can deliver checkmate to a king on the corner of the board. Please remember to keep playing chess and always schedule a moment for checking time. I am your host, Chris Torres. Please like and subscribe.